So in part 1 we talked about a faction called the Alliance of the Reasonable. They are mainly House Harlaw, House Blacktyde, and House Botley. And I can't stress enough how much these three houses are peas in a pod. Christopher Botley was fostered with Baelor Blacktyde, and Christopher and Baelor are the only off-islanders to visit Roderick the Reader. The three of them park their ships together at the Kingsmoot, and all of them vote for Asha. The three also seem to all have an affinity for Old Town. Roderick the Reader seems to be a fan of septons, maesters, and other academics. Baelor Blacktyde converted to the Faith of the Seven when he was a hostage of the Hightowers. And Christopher Botley weirdly thinks Old Town is one of the few places he can run in the world. Now in part 4 I talked about how House Mallister has the strongest motive and strongest opportunity to kill Balon. The Northerners absolutely positively need to take Moat Cailin, and the Mallisters have the Mirraham on the islands. But what the Mallisters lack is communication. They would need a maester to coordinate their plans. So let's once again go back to Balon's death and see if there's anything fishy with communication. Now by all accounts, Balon was crossing a bridge when he died. Now we're not sure who observed Balon's death, whether it's a servant or a maester, but we know that Maester Wendamyr did send an explanation of the events to Balon's wife on Harlaw. Balon fell to his death when a rope bridge broke beneath him. A storm was rising, and the bridge was swaying and twisting with each gust of wind. Or so we are told. Your mother had a bird from Maester Wendamyr. Now what's interesting is that House Harlaw got a raven after Balon's death, but Victarion didn't at Moat Cailin. Victarion only finds out about Balon's death after Euron returns. The same seems to be true of House Goodbrother and House Spar. They find out about Euron's return and Balon's death simultaneously, through one raven. House Merlin reports receiving 2 ravens, one from Euron and another from Roderick the Reader demanding fealty. But again, nothing from Wendamyr. What's also very odd is that Asha didn't get a raven from Wendamyr. She seems to have found out about her father's death and Euron's return at the same time, and she needs to ask Roderick how her father died exactly. So Wendamyr was very selective on who he told of Balon's death. He informed House Harlaw, but it also seems that he informed House Botley. According to the captain of the Mirraham, Sawane Botley was in Pike when Euron arrived. So it seems someone informed Botley of Balon's death. So in the first 24 hours after Balon's death, Maester Wendamyr alerted House Harlaw and House Botley. He alerted the Alliance of the Reasonable, the pro-Greenlander houses. Now we know that the Maesters want Theon to be the heir, as does Sawane Botley, and Roderick the Reader is very curious about Theon's fate. A pro-Theon position is an interesting position to take, as Theon is likely a hostage at this point. Wanting Theon to be king places the Ironborn in a position of weakness. If Theon is king, the war is essentially over. The Ironborn would have to make peace to get Theon back. And as we know from Baelor Blacktyde, the Alliance of the Reasonable did not like the war. And Balon's wife, who happens to be a Harlaw, was clearly under the impression that Theon was coming home. Now we, the reader, are supposed to dismiss her because she's insane, but what if she knows something that we don't? Could the Alliance of the Reasonable been trying to bring home Theon and end the war? Could they be complicit in Balon's death? Let's go back to Balon's death, but let's look at another account, the captain of the Mirraham. The way I heard it in Lordsport, there was a blow coming in from the west, rain and thunder, and old King Balon was crossing one of them bridges when the wind got hold of it and just tore the thing to pieces. He was washed up 2 days later, all bloated and broken. Crabs ate his eyes, I hear. So now we have 2 tales about the bridge that tell us that the bridge broke and Balon fell to his death. Now the second tale is a little more fantastic than the first, but that's what happens to gossip. It grows in excitement over time. The rising storm became a raging storm, and the snapped bridge became a destroyed bridge. However, that's not the story that's told to Euron. I had heard the storm god swept Balon to his death. Do I command the winds? So the breaking bridge has vanished from the story, and Balon simply slipped to his death because of the wind. Interestingly, slipping to one's death is what almost happens to Theon in Theon 2, A Clash of Kings. Now Balon slipping to his death is the story that Euron passes on to the other Ironborn. His grace was crossing a bridge at Pike when he fell, and was dashed upon the rocks below. And this is similar to the story that Aeron repeats at the Kingsmoot. The storm god in his wrath plucked Balon from his castle and cast him down. There's no talk of any bridge. Now independent of Euron's guilt, he would have asked Wendamyr how Balon died. And again, independent of his guilt, he would repeat Wendamyr's tale. Yet it seems that Wendamyr's tale to Euron is different from his tale to Balon's wife. Did the bridge break, or did Balon slip? And why would Wendamyr change his story? Well, I do have a theory. Let's say Balon was killed by a Maester assassin or Wendamyr himself. They dump the body over the bridge and then make up a story about the bridge breaking to send to Balon's wife. They don't have to worry about accuracy because Balon's wife is never expected to leave Harlaw. However, then Euron comes into town. Euron can see very clearly that the bridge is not broken, so Wendamyr has to tell a different tale, that Balon simply slipped. Regardless, the events surrounding Balon's death are awfully suspicious. On the first day, Balon dies. We know that Wendamyr informs Harlaw, and Botley travels to Pike. For a day, knowledge of Balon's death remains only within the Alliance of the Reasonable. On the second day, Euron arrives. He drowns Sawane Botley and gathers the support of Winch and Jaermun Botley. According to the captain of the Mirraham, on the third day, Balon's body washes up. And I'm guessing around now, Euron demands fealty from the rest of the Ironborn. Now, since the Mirraham knows about Balon's body washing up, they had to have left on at least the third day. However, they claim they left when Botley died, so there's a little bit of a contradiction in their story. Now we know that very soon after Euron demands fealty, Rodrik the Reader demands fealty for Asha. And Aeron receives word of Balon's death and Euron's return on Great Wyk. But what's astoundingly weird is that news of Sawane Botley's death also arrives on Great Wyk. Who sent that news? Good Brother even knows that Sawane Botley wanted Theon to be king. Euron didn't send it because the information is detrimental to his legitimacy. Wendamyr must have sent out the Raven secretly. The next day, Rodrik's letter demanding fealty arrives on Great Wyk, and Aeron prays. On the morning of what I estimate to be the 6th day, Aeron calls a king's moot. So it seems Euron arrived right in the middle of a lot of suspicious activity. We have the Alliance of the Reasonable with their unusual anti-war and pro-Theon stance. We have the Maesters with their pro-Theon stance and their suspicious ravens. And we have House Mallister with their tracking of Theon, their suspicious ravens, and their use of the Mirraham. But what's the connection between these three disparate forces? Well, it seems to be Old Town. The Alliance of the Reasonable seems to sympathize with Old Town, the Citadel is located in Old Town, and the Mirraham is out of Old Town. But here's the big question. The Mallisters clearly have a motive to kill Balon, and the Alliance of the Reasonable seems to have a motive to kill Balon. But why would anyone in Old Town have a motive to kill Balon? Well, as we know, the Hightowers are obsessed with prophecy and magic. And Euron seems to think that when the Kraken weds the dragon, something big will happen. He seems to think it's the Long Night. This prophecy may explain why House Hightower seems to have both dragonless and krakenless ambitions. House Hightower is trying to prevent the Long Night. After all, their motto is "We light the way." And the best way to do this is to prevent the King of the Krakens from marrying the Queen of the Dragons. Now, considering that the Hightowers seem to have brainwashed Baelor Blacktyde, and Baelor later warded Christopher Botley, and Rodrik the Reader is a fan of prophecy just like the Hightowers, it seems the Alliance of the Reasonable are the Hightowers' tools on the Iron Isles, which explains quite a few peculiar things with the Ironborn. For example, the Botleys ask Theon to take on Wex as a squire. However, knightship and squiredom are almost unheard of in the Iron Isles. Wex displays an almost supernatural ability to hide and spy, which makes me wonder, was Wex there to learn from Theon, or spy on Theon? And then there's Christopher Botley, a man who is inexplicably in love with Asha, despite the fact that he hasn't seen her in years. And keep in mind, when he did last see her, she was ugly. Christopher even goes as far as to ask Asha's mother for her hand. Now, one might argue that Christopher is only interested in land, or kingship, but he seems completely uninterested that he's been dispossessed of his land by his uncle. And Christopher is completely content to run off with Asha. So Christopher is not an opportunist, and he's not there for lust. Was he really bowled over by Asha's personality when she was 12? Or is he trying to stop the Kraken from marrying someone else? And then there's Hotho Harlaw. Now, Hotho is presented as an opportunist, but at the same time, he faithfully brings back a book from Old Town on prophecy for Rodrik. Hotho then tries to get Victarion to marry his daughter, an action that would prevent the Kraken from marrying the dragon. And then we have Jaermun Botley. Now, we don't know much about Jaermun, but he follows Euron. And let's not forget that Balon's wife was a Harlaw. So it seems the Alliance of the Reasonable has a pattern of trying to attach their family members to Greyjoys. And in at least 3 of these cases, they've tried to interfere with their marriages. Now you may be asking why the Alliance of the Reasonable is relevant. Well, as it turns out, their scheming is central to everything that's happening in the North. The Ironborn are the game changers, and we'll talk about this in Part 6.